Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody. Bob Dylan is in the news. Well, of course, he hasn't really been out of the news for the last 60 years, but he's been introduced to a new generation of viewers and listeners. His movie, A Complete Unknown, or the picture about him, A Complete Unknown, was a big hit. We did a show when it came out with the Dylan scholar Seth Rogovoy on it. Rogovoy wasn't a big fan of the book. He's the author of Bob Dylan, Prophet, Mystic, Poet, which focuses on the Jewish cultural and religious roots of Dylan's music. It's probably not surprising he didn't like the movie, given that there wasn't a lot of Judaism in it, one way or the other. We also did a show a few weeks ago with another cultural historian, an American, Paul Elie. His book, The Last Supper, Art, Faith, Sex, and Controversy in the 1980s, introduces the Christian Dylan, another side of the complexity of Bob Dylan. But we're back to the Jewish Dylan today with my guest, Harry Freedman, a London-based historian. He has a new book out, Bob Dylan, Jewish Roots, American Soil. And Harry is joining us from Hampstead Garden suburb in northwest London. Harry, did you see the movie A Complete Unknown? What did you think of it?
I did see it, Andrew, and I thought it was great. I really enjoyed it. I thought Timothy Chalamet was excellent. There are, when you're putting a life into 2 hours or 2.5 hours, you can't be completely accurate. There are a few ahistorical bits, few bits where they sort of run some history together. But as a movie, I thought it was really wonderful, and yeah, really enjoyed watching it.
Not a lot of Jewishness in it, though. I mean, if you were to watch that and knew nothing about Bob Dylan, there was the moment when one of his letters was addressed to a certain Zimmerman. But apart from that, no one could have guessed that Dylan was brought up in a religious Jewish community and family.
But I think that's right. I think that there's not a lot of Jewishness in Bob Dylan's public persona anyway. I mean, he spent the first 3 or 4 years of his career really trying to hide the fact he was Jewish. He's coming up with all sorts of backstories about living in growing up in the carnival or in the circus and playing with blues musicians and running away from home and all this stuff. None of which is true. He was growing up in a middle class Jewish home in Hibbing, but for whatever reason, he was embarrassed about his background, and that's quite natural. It's quite a lot of people are a bit like that, and so that's natural. But Dylan, I wrote a book about Leonard Cohen, and Leonard Cohen clearly is Jewish. He kept his Jewish name. He a lot of his lyrics are based on Jewish texts and Jewish ideas. Dylan isn't like that. Dylan is far more eclectic. So I've called the book Jewish Roots because I'm talking about where he's come from. He grew up in a Jewish environment. But if you look at Dylan as an artist, as a performer, there's not very much Jewish about him until maybe the last few years when he's sort of suddenly rediscovered his Jewishness.
What about you, Harry? You've written a lot about Jewish history, many different books. You've written about Britain's Jews, Shylock's Venice, Leonard Cohen, as you note, the Talmud, the Kabbalah. What is it about Dylan that has encouraged you to write this book? You're based in London. You're non-American.
I think what links all my books together really is the idea that Jewish culture, not particularly religious culture, but Jewish culture as a culture, is really not very well known. It's known as a religion, and it has obviously a reputation as a religion, and and as Jewish people with a history. But we have a very rich culture, and I think that culture, just like Greek culture or Latin culture or American culture, is a culture that's worth bringing to the world. So I write about Jewish culture, but I don't write about it from a evangelical point of view or a religious point of view. I'm just trying to get across the idea there is another culture out there which you've heard a lot about because you've heard a lot about Jews, but you don't necessarily know what that culture is. So for me, Bob Dylan is a typical Jewish performer in the sense that he had an ambition and a way of going about his career, which was, you could compare Bob Dylan to a Jewish businessman and say, yeah, they're doing the same thing. They're ambitious, they're driven, they're focused, they know what they want, and they're going for it. And that's really why I wrote the book, to show that Dylan has these roots. But then when we get into the book, I'm trying to show how those roots impact on his career and impact on the choices that he makes.
Some people, Harry, might be listening to this and saying, Harry's saying that Jews are defined by their ambition. I mean, firstly, that's veering into anti-Semitic trope. Secondly, isn't that true of every different culture? Everyone's ambitious. Everyone wants to make something of themselves.
Yeah, I'm not saying define, but I'm saying that Jews, because of their history, because of centuries of being downtrodden and then becoming immigrants into, whether it's America or Europe, wherever they've become an immigrant into, they're striving to succeed, and that is a Jewish trait these days. It wasn't always. It's a Jewish trait these days. I don't think
Jews strive to succeed as opposed to what other people who don't.
No, Jews strive to reach the same place in society that everybody else is in. And now Dylan is almost the last generation of those striving Jews. Now, Jews Jews tend to be middle class, not all by any means, but certainly there's as many middle class Jews as there are middle class anybody else is, and they're all educated and they're all working ordinary jobs, and the striving has gone. But Dylan marked that period of those people who he didn't crawl out of the ghetto. But there was a whole.
He walked out of it, didn't he? I mean, he walked all the way from Hibbing to New York.
Yeah, he hitched
Harry, we did a show a couple of months ago with a very prominent American writer, David Denby, is one of the best-known movie reviewers on The New Yorker. He had a new book out, Eminent Jews. It was a book about Leonard Bernstein, Mel Brooks, Betty Friedan, and Norman Mailer. They weren't the only eminent Jews in the middle of the 20th century. But I'm not sure if you've seen the book. I mean, there were many eminent Jews in Dylan's generation, the Bernstein, Brooks, Friedan, Mailer generation. Would you place Bob Dylan within that generation of mid-century, culturally creative, ambitious, iconoclastic American Jews?
Yeah, except for the mid-century, because he's mid-century, but he's also late century. He's younger than those people. He's
right. What was it? When was he born?
Born in 41. He's not.
Yeah, and I think that Denby's crew were born in the mid-30s. So I wonder if there's a big difference between being born in 41 versus the early to mid-30s.
Oh, I think so, because I think that if you're born in 31, the chances are that your parents are immigrants. If you're born in the 40s, 50s, the chances are your grandparents are immigrants, and that makes a big difference. And Dylan's parents were, his father ran a white goods shop. They sold washing machines and fridges and stuff like that. His grandfather came across from the old country, from Europe, and his grandfather had to establish himself. They start, the typical route is you start off as a peddler or a market trader, you build yourself up, you buy a shop, and that's where Dylan's father comes in. The shop is already there. He's working in the shop with his brothers. So I think that Dylan is different, qualitatively different from people like Bernstein, from Irving Berlin. They are the children of immigrants, or sometimes even immigrants themselves. Moses Ashe in Greenwich Village, who is very important in the folk scene, is the son of Sholem Ashe, who was a Yiddish novelist living in Poland. I think it makes a big difference.
I have to admit that, given Dylan's elusiveness, or perhaps the most defining quality, his refusal to be boxed up into anything, which probably defines his remarkable career in many ways, I was surprised with how emotional he was in his autobiography, Chronicles, of his description of his father. He didn't write much about his Jewish identity, but I thought, I'm curious as to your interpretation, I thought he wrote in a very warm way about his father, about his disability. They clearly weren't close, but he was also very affectionate towards him.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that he's, his public statements, the Chronicles is slightly different. Chronicles is, he's to some degree wearing his heart on his sleeve. He was close to his parents. He went, you might think if you know Dylan's history and, as you say, his elusiveness, that when his father died, he might have just shrugged his shoulders and got on with it. He didn't. He went back home. He sat shiver. He did the things that Jewish people do when a close relative dies. So he has that. But at the same time, when he got married, and he married a Jewish woman, and that's quite unusual. I don't know whether he did that deliberately or not. But when he got married, his parents weren't at the wedding, so it's really hard to know what the relationship was. But then that's that is part of Dylan. The elusiveness of him is just part of who he is.
Let's get to his history. I was doing a bit of research for this on Wikipedia, at least. I didn't quite realize how much of a Jewish family and culture Dylan grew up in. How deeply rooted was it in your view? You've obviously done a lot of research for this book.
I think it was deep. And in many ways, I think it was typically deep. They weren't a particularly religious family. If they were religious, they'd be living in Brooklyn or somewhere where there was a long-established religious community. But they were a committed family. His father is the president of B'nai B'rith, which is a big sort of.
And this is in Hibbing, in Minnesota.
Hibbing, Minnesota, absolutely, yeah. His father is president of B'nai B'rith. His mother works for Hadassah. These are sort of social welfare organizations. Every year, every summer, Dylan goes to a Jewish camp. When he goes to university, he goes into a Jewish frat house. He doesn't stay long. He doesn't get on with the other kids there, but he goes there. It's in his blood. There are 500 people are invited to his bar mitzvah. There are only 280 Jews in Hibbing, but 500 people are invited. So it's there. But what he does, which is typical of many Jewish people across all generations, is he sees an outside world. And he wants part of that, and he needs to break away from the, if you like, the cloyingness of a closed Jewish community, the expectations that you're going to become a lawyer or a doctor or an accountant, the expectations you're going to marry somebody Jewish and stay within the family. That's that's quite restrictive, and I think that Dylan, particularly growing up in the 60s, which were a time of, as he noted, of huge change. He had to get away from that. So that's one of the reasons I think why he came up with all these backstories about his origins. But it's certainly there. It's certainly there in his background.
I know in the book you suggest occasionally that his Jewish identity was elusive for him because of anti-Semitism. Did he ever experience that growing up, do you think, in Hibbing, Minnesota? I know he was born in Duluth, which is a larger town, but clearly Hibbing, as you say, it wasn't Brooklyn. It wasn't New York. There weren't that many Jews there.
There weren't that many Jews. And I mean, I put an anecdote in the book about one of the teachers saying that the Finns hate the Bohemians and the Bohemians hate somebody else and everybody hates the Jews, which is a bit like a Tom Lehrer song. But I think he was in a minority. He was probably the only Jewish kid in his class. When his girlfriend, his school days girlfriend, asked him if he was Jewish, he got very surly, and one of his friends said to her, "Don't ever ask him that again." So I suspect there was a certain amount of anti-Jewishness then. Remember, we're talking about during the war. There's all sorts of things going on in Germany. He's got a German name, he's Zimmerman.
To put it mildly.
Yeah. So so there are tensions about being Jewish in those days. As there are now, and I think that I don't know any actual events which record Jewishness. I mean, the classic event obviously is the Judas call when he plays in Manchester, but it's 1965. That's later, and there was that anti-Semitic, probably not, but but he probably took it as being anti-Semitic. I don't know. I really don't know how much.
Did he ever go to Israel? What was his relationship with Zionism in Israel?
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? He says very little about Israel, except when he's in his first album, he does a song called "Talking Hava Nagila Blues," which is he's just taking the Mickey out of Hava Nagila. It's hardly a song, and he says this is a foreign song that I picked up in Utah. So he's taking the Mickey out of that. But then he writes a song a bit later called "Neighborhood Bully" about Israel. And it's he's being facetious. He's saying that here's a country surrounded by all these people who are stronger and bigger than Israel, and Israel is a neighborhood bully. Now, okay, that's sensitive talk these days. I think he cared about Israel. He does go there, but not a lot. Until more recently, he goes there more recently these days because he's now got involved with Chabad, and he's doing a lot of fundraising for them. But there's
fundraising for who?
For Chabad, the evangelical Hasidic group, Lubavitch.
You noted that you wrote a book about Leonard Cohen, The Mystical Roots of Genius, which also deals with both Judaism and Christianity. And Cohen is a hero in as you know, I'm sure, in Israel. Yeah. He went he was there in 67 and 73. Comparing Dylan to Cohen is very interesting because Cohen came from a much more intellectual Jewish family, and as you know, it was in the blood for Cohen, whereas for Dylan it was more complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Cohen is proud of his Jewishness. He's a more spiritual person, really. Dylan is much more eclectic. Dylan is influenced by many different people, artists, musicians, in many different directions, and his music reflects that. Cohen's music is mainly spiritual. It's a little bit deeper generally, and the Jewish side of Cohen is quite strong. There's a lovely story told about how he's being interviewed. This is the beginning. This is Cohen, the beginning of his career, and the interviewer says to him, "Leonard Cohen, don't you find your name a bit embarrassing? Have you ever thought about changing it?" And he says, "Yes." And she said, "Well, what would you change it to?" And he says, "September." She says, "Oh, Leonard September, how lovely." He said, "No, September Cohen." And that was where that was Cohen's relationship to his Judaism. Whereas Dylan, of course, changes his name, so it's a different thing.
The book, Harry, is called Jewish Roots, American Soil. What do you? I mean, so many books have been written about Dylan now. Libraries full. What are you saying that hasn't been said before? I noted that Seth Rogovoy has a book out, Bob Dylan, Prophet, Mystic, Poet, about Judaism and Dylan. What are you saying that hasn't been said before?
Right, Seth's book is very different. Seth is trying to find the Jewish connection all the way through Dylan's lyrics and Dylan's life story. What I'm trying to do really with Dylan is to set him into his historical context. He comes to prominence in the early 60s. It's a time of huge change, and he becomes famous as a protest singer. I often wonder whether if he hadn't had that phase in his career, if he just gone straight into the Dylan of 1967, say, of Nashville Skyline or something like that, whether he ever would have achieved the same level of prominence. What I'm trying to do is to show how Dylan reacts, and much against his will, becomes a spokesperson for his generation in terms of the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, all the things that are going on in the States at the time. And I see this really as, obviously, he could have gone this way even without being Jewish, but I think his Jewishness added a dimension to that, because he grows up in an environment which is strongly focused on welfare and human rights. And I think that's very much part of why he chooses not just to become a folk singer, but to become a folk singer who is pointing the finger at what's wrong in society and talking about the changing world. Everybody knew, I'm of the same generation. Everybody knew the world was changing, but Dylan articulated it. He put into words what everybody else was thinking, and that was his great strength. And I think that a lot of that, particularly his use of words, comes from his Jewishness.
Yeah, I have to admit I'm not convinced. I mean, it's a very general argument. I thought, I don't know if you in the movie, Albert Grossman, his agent, was presented as the sort of quintessential moneyed Jew. There was almost a degree of anti-Semitism, one might have said, about his portrayal. But you could have said that about any artist in the early 60s, couldn't you?
You could, of course you could have done. Of course you could. But I think the point about Dylan is that what he did was he never joined the anti-war movement. He only touched on the civil rights movement, but he spoke about it and he drew people.
Well, I know, I take your point, and that's that's something that's really focused on in A Complete Unknown and his relationship with Joan Baez. Yeah. Baez was politically committed, Dylan wasn't. But again, what's Jewish about that?
I think the use of language. I think
but coming back to this idea of uncommitment or an ability to skate over everything and everyone, there's nothing particularly Jewish about that, or even American. Is there? Is something uniquely, something that only Bob Dylan has perfected? I don't know anyone else.
As an artist, possibly. But if you look, for example, at Freedom Summer, which is the year when students from all over America went to the South to join the voter registration campaign, there's a disproportionate number of Jews there. Now, why is that? Is it something in their background? I don't want to analyze why that might be, but what I'm saying is that just as a disproportionate number of Jews joined in with that, so Dylan is a voice looking at the social ills and the changing world and agitating really for change. And
although he didn't go. I mean, that defines Dylan. I mean, it seems to me that the most defining quality of Bob Dylan is his ability to invent and reinvent himself. Is there anything Jewish, particularly Jewish, about that, or is that really just an American thing?
I think it's a bit of both. I think that what he was doing was, he's ambitious, and what he's trying to do is he always knew this from a young age. He was going to be a success. And he's finding the route to success, and he identifies the route, just as a market trader or somebody working in small loans might find the route to becoming a big banker, because that's part of their drive and their ambition. I think that's what's driving Dylan as well.
There's also talent. There were many Bob Dylan, shall we say, many called, fewer chosen. I mean, there are many failed guys who didn't become Dylan, who wanted to become folk singers. What is it about Dylan that makes him a success? Many kids from small towns, some Jews, some not, who came to New York trying to become stars, musical stars, movie stars, and many of them failed. Why the success of Dylan? Is it just because he was so talented?
No, well, yes, but his talent really, particularly at the beginning, lies in his lyrics and his words. He has a use of language. That's why he deserved the Nobel Prize, because fundamentally he's a poet. And when he started, he wasn't a great musician. He was playing folk music, few chords on a guitar, and his voice was awful. But it was his lyrics which sort of kept him going. And as he matured and as he became a success, he became a better musician. And now he's a musician as well. If you listen to his first album, there's nothing of any great musical quality there. But what there is in the two songs he writes there in that first album is a lyrical talent which grows and develops through his career. And I think that really is that defines Dylan. A bit like Cohen. Cohen is also a poet. They're poets who set their poetry to music, and that's why they're not just another obscure poet, but a famous one.
The astonishing thing about Dylan, though, is the speed of his creativity. I remember there was a famous conversation with Cohen about Dylan, and Cohen said he met Bob Dylan and they were talking about how they write songs, and Cohen, notorious, was famous for spending so much time. Some songs took him years to write. And he talked to Dylan, and Dylan said, well, that one took me 15 minutes or an hour or a couple of hours. Is that just genius in Dylan? I mean, again, it's not Jewishness or Americanness. I mean, somehow this guy was able to produce a remarkable amount of songs so quickly, and he still is. Yeah.
No, I don't think it's anything to do with Jewishness. I think it is genius. I think it's the way his mind works. Cohen is focused on the detail, and Dylan is focused on the impact, and so he can write a song which is remarkable, very quickly, because he's looking at the impact of the song, whereas Cohen wants to get every word right. And for example, Hallelujah, he writes several versions with different lyrics all the way through. That's just different people, different ways of doing it.
There's a great movie about Hallelujah, about the making, the writing of the song. I know that in the movie, Woody Guthrie features very strongly. In fact, the movie is built around the times that Dylan went to visit Guthrie. And for you in the book as well, Guthrie is very important. What's the role of Guthrie? I mean, he certainly was anything but Jewish.
Well, you say that. Guthrie wrote more songs about Hanukkah than anybody else. He wrote several songs.
Did?
He did. His wife is Jewish. Arlo Guthrie is Jewish, because his mother was Jewish. So Guthrie does have a connection, but that's not why Dylan was going to see Guthrie. Guthrie was Dylan's role model, his hero. He wanted to be Woody Guthrie, and this is a young man who's reinventing himself, and the model he's taking to reinvent himself on is Woody Guthrie. And in the film, it's not, there are scenes in the film which are probably historically not correct, like Dylan and Seeger sitting together at Guthrie's bedside. Probably didn't happen. Dylan goes to see Guthrie, Seeger does, other people do as well, but they probably didn't go together to see him. But that's because you're making a film and you've got to condense events into a small time frame. But Woody Guthrie was, he is Dylan's role model. And until Dylan discovered that he could go beyond Woody Guthrie, he wanted to be Woody Guthrie.
Well, but again, coming back to your book, Harry, I mean, everybody knows that. I mean, it's a truism about Dylan's obsession with Guthrie. What are you saying that hasn't been said before about Dylan's relationship with Guthrie?
I'm not saying anything at all about that hasn't been said before. Not everybody has read every book about Dylan, so some people don't know that. But it's part of Dylan's story, and you can't tell Dylan's story without relating to Guthrie. What I can say though, and I think this does need to be said, is that Guthrie was too ill and too out of it to really relate to Dylan. Dylan thinks that Guthrie's his best friend, but the chances are that Guthrie really had no idea who Dylan was, or he was just another person around his bedside in the haze that Guthrie was living in at the time.
The movie also features, as you know, Pete Seeger. Again, I'm not sure how accurate it is. How important was Seeger and particularly Seeger's relationship with Guthrie for Dylan? In the movie, it's presented as a kind of complicated triangle where Seeger eventually became perhaps a little envious of Dylan's genius and success.
Yeah, I think Dylan is the face of folk music. Where when Dylan reaches Greenwich Village, the folk music revival is at its peak and it's beginning to commercialize. And Seeger's the one who's trying to hold it back from being commercialized. It's Albert Grossman who's commercializing it by getting Peter, Paul, and Mary to sing Dylan's songs and make hits out of them. Seeger is a purist. Seeger wants to stick with the tradition of folk music, and so for Dylan, Seeger is the sort of the king of the folk movement, but Dylan's got his own plans, his own ambition. He wants to go his own way, and it all comes to a head, of course, at Newport when Dylan goes electric. And the story is probably not true, but the idea behind the story is correct. That Seeger wants to cut the electric cable with an axe because he can't stand this electric music. Seeger's important, but I don't think he was important to Dylan in the way that Guthrie was.
So on the one hand, you write about Guthrie in terms of Dylan's American roots. And then, of course, there were the Beats, Allen Ginsberg in particular, Jack Kerouac, William Burroughs. How central were they? And how does that sort of interact or mix with Dylan's Jewish roots?
I think they're central in as much as they're where Dylan gets his understanding that you can do things with language. So what the Beats were doing was to use language in a new way, and Dylan is reading Kerouac and he's listening to Burroughs, and he's becoming friends with Ginsberg, and he's understanding that language is a tool that you can use in order to express yourself in different ways. And why is that Jewish? Well, I think there is a Jewish connection with language. Jews are, we call the people of the book. Jews talk a lot. Jews like talking, and I think that's part of,
Jews like talk. You mean as opposed to other people?
Particularly, yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so. If you walk into a room full of Jews, it's probably a lot noisier than it is in a room full of people who aren't Jews, and that's just a cultural thing. And I think that Dylan, the beat poets, just as Guthrie influenced Dylan in terms of folk music, so the beats influenced Dylan in terms of words. And then he learns about other poets as well. He learns about the French poets, Rimbaud, Verlaine, people like that, and he expands his knowledge. But it's the beats who take him there in the first place.
What about the African American community? Black Americans like talking as well. Perhaps they compete with Jews in terms of their quote unquote noisiness.
Yeah.
What was the influence of Black America and Black American music on Dylan in the early days in terms of his roots? You talk about American soil. It's hard to talk about the American soil without talking about the history and complexity and controversy of Black America.
Absolutely. So when Dylan is a kid, he's lying in bed listening to the radio. He's listening to blues. He's listening to Black music. He's friends with. As he gets older, he becomes friends with the Freedom Singers, who are obviously a Black group. He goes to the southern states during Freedom Summer to take part in the voting campaign, not as an activist. He just flies in together with Theo Biko and Pete Seeger to do a concert. He's connected to the Black community. He sings about Oxford Town, about the failure of the university to allow Black students in. So he has a connection with Black people. I don't think he knows until he gets to New York anyway, doesn't know very many Black people. And I think that's part of his education as he's maturing.
His second wife was Black, wasn't she?
The second wife Black?
Yeah.
I don't know that. It's beyond my time frame.
But his first wife, as you know, was Jewish.
Yes. Yeah.
And of course, some people would argue his greatest album was Tangled Up in Blue, which is, whilst he always denies it, it's fairly self-evident that it was an album about the breakup of his marriage.
Yeah.
What did that experience teach him, perhaps, not just about marriage and the blues, both in musical and in emotional terms, but also about Judaism?
Well, he's done that before. He did that when he broke up with Susie Rotolo. He sings.
Was she Jewish too, Susie?
She wasn't Jewish. No, she wasn't Jewish. But I'm talking about the breakup. He puts a lot of his emotions into his songs there. Don't think twice. It's all right. It's all over now, baby blue. These are songs where he's putting his heart out. Boots of Spanish leather. He, despite his sort of elusiveness, he does sing about his personal feelings. How they affected him emotionally beyond that, I don't know. But these are things that we all have to deal with in our own ways. I can't really sort of give an opinion on that.
I noted that we did a show with Paul Eli on The Last Supper about the 80s, and there's some really interesting stuff in there about Dylan's conversion to Christianity in his quote-unquote Christian period. What do you make of that? Was that also a kind of weirdly Jewish thing to suddenly become a Christian and embrace it?
No, I don't think. I think that's a superstar thing. I think an awful lot of celebrities go searching for some sort of spiritual meaning. You saw it with Madonna, with Kabbalah, and lots of people. I think if you're in that world, your life is so remote from ordinary people. You're always looking. You're always trying to find something else. I don't think there's any. Certainly no Jewish sort of impulse there. And it doesn't last long. He lasts a few years and then he comes back. And when he does come back, he's far more involved with his Judaism than he was before he started.
He's on the road. He's always been on the road. There's some wonderful lines from that in Blood on the Tracks. He's currently doing an outlaw music festival with Willie Nelson, Sheryl Crow, Lucinda Williams. I'm actually going to see him on the East Coast later this summer. Right. What about Dylan now? I'm guessing, Harry, you didn't have the opportunity to talk to him.
No.
When he looks back at his life, do you think that what you call these Jewish roots are still relevant when he goes to sleep at night? Does he think about it?
I don't know whether any of us think about it in those ways. That's too conscious, that's too deliberate. But I think that he's certainly much more involved with the Jewish world now than he was. So he may have gone and played at a fundraiser one evening and come back and thought a little bit about it. But no, look, Dylan is his own person. He always was, and that's why he became such a big star. He wasn't going to be told by anybody else how to do things. He knew what he wanted. He's always been very, very self-directed. And now in his 80s, he can look back on his career, I would imagine, with a certain amount of satisfaction.
Has he got anything left to do or prove? I mean, his last album was remarkable.
Yeah. Well, I suppose that's what you're proving when you get to that age. You're proving that you still got it. You're proving you can still do it. That old age hasn't defeated you. And if he is trying to prove anything, that's probably what it is. I'm still here. I'm still good.
Well, that's an interesting thesis. Harry Freedman's new book, Bob Dylan, Jewish Roots, American Soil. I have to ask you, Harry, because it's the kind of questions that one asks at the ends of these sorts of interviews. What do you think is the song that most somehow proves or encapsulates your thesis of Dylan's Jewish roots and American soil, this quintessential American artist who needs to be understood in terms of his Jewish roots? Which song? I mean, we all have our favorite not Jewish Dylan songs, but which is the one that somehow captures this, or perhaps an album?
I think it's The Times They Are A-Changing and Freewheeling and The Times They Are A-Changing, because this is Dylan at his most inventive. This is Dylan where he's put his finger on something that's nobody could quite articulate, but he's done it. Your children are beyond your command. He's saying to parents what all the kids know, but he's saying it in such a simple, easy way. And I remember when it came out, it was just so striking. And I think for me, and change is part of what it is to be Jewish, because Jews have been through change, for centuries, and particularly in the 20th century, with all the things that happened and the families who moved from Europe to the States, change is part of what they were. So I think for me, The Times They Are Changing encapsulates Dylan.
Well, the times are a-changing. Harry Freedman, author, Bob Dylan, Jewish Roots, American Soil, perhaps America's greatest artist, certainly greatest 20th century musical artist. Thank you so much, Harry. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you.
And best of luck with all your writing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks. All the best. Cheers.